Hey viewers, this is Random Stuff with Alex Hughes, and today I'm going to talk about some films I've been watching for film class. So we've reached a time point where the films are getting longer, and there's a lot more thought being put into it as the film industry grew. And so today I actually finished them up for the most part, but I started off watching Policeman's Little Run, which was a film made in the early 1900s, and I believe it's French. But the basically the premise of the story is that there's this really bulky looking, looks like a pit bull or something, that steals a piece of meat from a roadside market, um, and then the police, there's like 20 of the officers decide to run after this dog and chase him throughout the city, and the people I think don't realize that there's a film going on, which is still something that happens to this day, but I think there's a lot more control over it. Um, but the people are just watching, in the background, like, what's going on? Why are these police officers chasing this dog with a piece of meat? I think it's quite impressive how they were able to have that dog hold onto the meat and kind of run into different areas. It could have been like, they spliced the film and, certain scenes with the dogs they kind of adjusted. But the turnaround of this film is when the dog starts chasing the officers, and it looks kind of ridiculous because the officers are, well equipped in their old style, police uniforms. They have batons and they're, ready to kind of take down this dog. But the dog is so aggressive and, chases after all these men. Um, I'm not sure if the dog has been, if the dog still, if it's a male dog, those dogs get aggressive if they aren't fixed, I would say. So I don't know if that was a common thing at this time, but yeah, that dog was jumping at these actors. I don't know if they had stunt doubles in those days, but I think some of them took some bites. But it's kind of funny how that the officers run back to their police station. They're all clamoring, and it's really just, you think of a police officer as, authority, as power, but at this instance, they let a dog get the best of them, and they all, huddle in, scared. And I like the ending. They have a pose of the dog, very stoic. A piece of meat in its mouth. Dogs do a great job at posing for cameras, I would say. And the next film I watched was The Golden Beetle, and I think it's the fascination with mysticism, especially in the 1800s. There was this wave of spiritualism, the Ouija boards and talking with the dead. And there's this guy who looks like a genie or something, an old guy, who starts conjuring up all these, images of the fairies, and it's amazing amount of effects that they use. It's really trippy. It reminds me of something from the '60s, when the drug use was affecting these directors. But at this point, it's amazing all the color that they used on the film. Uh, and then they used a lot of female, like, fairies. I also believe, I remember watching Mysteries at the Museum. Now, fairies were really popular at this time, and the public was just like wondering if they actually existed. Because I remember there was this case where, this photograph was taken, and it looked like there was this, tiny fairy that these young girls were playing with, and I think it was playing off this idea, of the general public's fascination with, magic and illusion, because I lost my train of thought there, but Houdini was really popular at this time as well. So this director was a former magician, and he did a great job just with the imagery, the color, and the just a whole bunch. It's just amazing how they were able to do this. Like a jump cut, and all of a sudden these fairy characters are there, and you're like, whoa. Another of the movies I watched in that playlist was some with Max Linder, and he was like a silent movie comedian, slapstick comedy. In the book, it said he was a predecessor to Charlie Chaplin, and I actually really enjoyed his comedy. I thought his facial expressions were hilarious. I thought that just the way he acted in front of these, highbrow people of the time, that are all dressed up, his movements were so fast, especially in that I think it was a 15-minute video. It's amazing just how fast he is in terms of his movements, and it seems like he's crazy. He's like running around in circles, jumping and and doing all these bizarre things. He pushes a guy, and the guy goes through an entire wall. So it's really just taking humor and comedy to an exaggerative level. Um, but I would say that it's probably the funniest of all the stuff that I've watched so far. Another one was Troubles of a Grass Widower. I don't know why they call it a grass widower. Some of these old movies have very strange names, but it's really a lot about what it says about society at the time, how the wife, does a lot of the housework, the cooking and the cleaning and the organizing, while the husband does he brings home the bacon. And so, the husband's just trying to eat dinner and read his newspaper. Sounds very, 1950s America. Man reads a newspaper in his chair, drinks some coffee, and but the wife wants to talk with him, and the husband he's not wanting it. He just wants to quietly read and eat. And then his wife gets very emotional, and she basically leaves to her mother. I guess it's another sign of the times, right? The mom is the probably one that had a big part in the marriage, and she's trying to console her daughter. And then the husband realizes that she's gone, and he has to do the stuff himself. And I think the message of the story is that there's a reason why you have a wife, and that's to help clean the dishes and do the house or jobs, because the husband can't do it. He's like I think he uses like outside water to wash the dishes. He uses a hose to spray everything. It's actually really gross. I'm surprised there's no running water. I mean, they're washing dishes in a bucket, and then just look at the kitchen. It's like, where's the refrigerator? And they have like a cast iron stove. I'm like, dang, I'm glad I didn't live at that time period. Cleaning has gotten a lot more convenient since then. But so just looking at that story, I think it's the ridiculous. It sounds like he's never stepped foot in like the kitchen before or done anything in the house, because he's trying to find his bow tie. He ends up tearing the whole house apart, even though he just put it in the bedroom. I mean, that's pretty ridiculous. And so the wife ends up saving the day. She comes back, and uh, the house is all back together. So it's clearly a representation of society at the time, in the roles of men and women, in the household and in marriage as well. Another one that I watched is 7 Years Bad Luck, and it's kind of like a reference to the idea as if you break a mirror, you get 7 years bad luck, and so that's kind of um, an, a reference to that. And what ends up happening is, I think there's Max Linder again in the film, the comedian, and the weird thing is the maid is making out with the butler. I'm like, whoa, maybe that's what happened in those days, right? I'm sure rich people still have, butlers and maids and whatnot, but those were pretty popular, I guess, before. And then the maid, runs into the mirror, breaks it, and so they decide that they have to find. I don't think they want to tell Max about the fact that they just destroyed his mirror. So they ended up doing this thing. They take the chef, and then they dress him up to look just like the Max Linder. He's about to shave too, and it's pretty funny actually. It's pretty trippy. But the thought pops in your head like, man, I wonder if I would actually think I was that other person, especially if they did a great job doing that. But I've seen this comedy thing, where someone's like matching someone else in the mirror, or just movement so it looks like a mirror reflection. I think I saw it in Tom and Jerry, one of the episodes by. It was an episode by, I think, Chuck Jones, and I think they're on a ship or something, and um, they're trying. There's a scene where basically I think two cats are copying each other's actions, and it's kind of reminded me of this idea. I think I've seen it elsewhere in comedy too. but it's pretty funny though. Just like him shaving, and the chef is doing a pretty good job at matching up the movements. And another film I watched was Gertie the Dinosaur. Amazing. I didn't even think there was animation. I know I've seen some early cartoons from the 20s and 30s, but I didn't realize there was anything like this. And this guy did a great job with this cartoon. Um, it's weird because it blends like live action and cartoon, which is pretty significant and pretty amazing how they were able to do that. I know that Tom and Jerry did that as well. And it was pretty impressive for the time, where Gene Autry is dancing with Jerry the mouse, and it's very synchronized. But this is pretty amazing. This cartoonist is trying to prove that he can make this dinosaur move, just by drawing it. And these highbrow guys, they look like older men, very wealthy, probably like family wealth or something like that in those days. And they're sitting around a very nice dining table. I didn't realize they had cars in those days because it was like 1914. I thought the Model T was like the first car, but they end up drawing something, or he ends up drawing something on this kind of large piece of paper. And this dinosaur is so cute, actually. No pupils though in this dinosaur, but a very funny dinosaur. And it still reminds me of kids' cartoon, actually. And the cartoonist is kind of like ordering the dinosaur to do this and this. And the dinosaur is kind of rebellious and takes a little bit of time. I think the cartoon maybe it was a bit harder for this time to actually get the drawing to move, because at some points it feels like the cartoon freezes, but eventually the dinosaur moves. And at one point, it's hilarious, the dinosaur tries to mess with the elephant and ends up throwing the elephant into the lake. And then elephant's just wondering what's going on, and then the dinosaur throws a rock at the elephant. So it's pretty funny what the dinosaur ends up doing. I actually really enjoyed that. Little Nemo was another cartoon that I watched, and I definitely saw some stereotypes in regards to natives. The native was very white, but the lips were big, and then crazy, messed up hair, and looks like a pelt around his waist. But that was definitely something I've seen in other cartoons, when they talk about, native and indigenous cultures, the kind of the stereotype that they're like dancing around a fire and whatnot. But it's really trippy because they are actually like blending these characters all up together. And I like the fact that they use color, though. That was impressive because it really popped out. So it's like the native and a couple other characters just start to kind of do some random things. And it almost reminds me of the Kesha music video, Your Love Is My Drug, where these cartoon characters just morph into other things. And it's really visual if you ever seen that video before. But other than that, the two main films were Fantomas, the Guillotine, and that was quite impressive. A very entertaining story, even without any sound in terms of dialogue. But they did have pretty consistent cards, which was nice, which wasn't really seen in the the Roman film. That, or was like Quo Vadis or something. I don't speak Latin, but what I ended up seeing was that movie didn't have enough of those cue cards. So I was like, what are they doing? What are they talking about? I can see their lips move, but I can't really understand what they're doing. But this movie had the music, though, was also great. They changed up the music depending on the mood. Sometimes when it was kind of suspense, the music got a little bit creepier and creepier, kind of eerie. And it really reminded me of something from the movies, which was a PC game released about almost 15 years ago, where you can make, you could choose audio and then make your own custom movie, graphic. It was pretty clunky graphics, but it reminded me a lot of that. The music, that really kind of gritty sounding, but it sounds old. It doesn't sound like the gritty music of, like, the 60s and 70s movies. It sounds like ancient, not ancient, but like, old Western style, piano and whatnot. Music, but the story itself is really well written with different plot twists. Fantomas, I don't know if the beginning part's relevant, where he robs that lady at the hotel, but I think it's supposed to represent his ability to change into different costumes, which is something that's seen, and I think there was a Leonardo DiCaprio movie made about like 18 years ago, where he can disguise himself as different people. But it's pretty cool how he's able to do that. He dresses up as the bellhop and then sneaks out. And then, but the bigger plot reveals itself when another, I think his name was Lord Mathis or something. But he disappears, and then this detective is on the case. Very classic detective, always smoking cigarettes, which was something that was really popular in old movies. People are always like smoking tobacco in some form, whether it's cigar, Columbo style, or a pipe, like Sherlock Holmes. But this guy was just rolling up cigarettes. Pretty often throughout the film. And then so that's definitely a sign of the times, in society, how cigarette smoking was normalized, and a lot of people were doing it. But he ends up, Fantomas, I guess, has like this affair with this lord's wife. I assume something went down where she wanted him to assassinate the lord, so that way they could be together and she could probably keep his money. That's how it works with the wives. And what ends up happening is that Fantomas gets caught, because they find the body of the lord in the trunk, which I feel like is a pretty common thing in those type of movies. They put the body in the trunk, and he's trying to send it off to Johannesburg, trying to get away with the crime. But what ends up happening is the detective catches him, and he gets sent to death row. Another sign of the times is the fact that they use the guillotine, which I don't think is used anymore, as a form of execution. You know, it sounds something like from the Louis the whatever age, in Europe, where they, chop people's head. Oh, the French Revolution was a time when they used the guillotine a lot. Um, but I was surprised they still used that in the 1900s. But then again, they had some pretty shoddy technology in those days. But what's up happening is that the maiden wants to get Fantomas out of the prison before the execution date. And so what ends up happening is this guy, I guess, this famous actor, playwright, ends up looking so much like Fantomas, and it plays him in an actual play, that she ends up trying to do a switch bait. Whatever narcotic she slips him, that's also something, a sign of the times. I don't know what type of narcotic it is. At that time, illegal drugs. I don't even know if there were illegal drugs. That was, especially since it's in France. But she ends up spiking his drink, the actor's drink, and ends up switching him out, which I've seen before in movies. This idea where someone looks just like another person, so they do like a switch, or they kind of disguise themselves as that person, and they're like, and then they fool people with that. I've seen that type of trick happen in movies. But so what ends up happening is that right before Fantomas, or the actor, is about to be executed, the detective realizes this isn't Fantomas, and he rips off his disguise, which happens like what happens in Scooby-Doo. You see the bad guys dressed up, and then usually Scooby-Doo like rips off the disguise, and it's like all the teens are like, oh, this is so and so, and then it's like, you darn kids, that type of idea, where there's like this person disguised rips off the disguise, and the detective basically becomes obsessed with finding Fantomas, but ends up to his avail. Cool part is how they were able to make this guy like the Invisible Man. He starts to appear just out of nowhere, and then just disappears. I don't know how they did that on film, but that was very impressive. how they were able to do that, especially just being the early 1900s, how they were able to make this guy just come out and then disappear. And then the end. So you're kind of left with a cliffhanger. What happens to the mistress and Phantomus? What happens to the actor? Is the actor, scarred? What happens to the detective? Does he just become obsessed and never does anything new? And those are some, cliffhanger endings that, sometimes movies like to do, especially Star Wars. You're like, what happens at the end of this Star Wars movie? There's so much more that needs to be addressed, but that's how they keep you watching the franchise. And the last movie I watched was House Divided. And this movie was actually really interesting, very funny movie. Dialogue was a little bit less than Phantomus, but it's, about this typical husband and wife couple. I think they live in the city or something. She's a housewife. He's, doing like office work, very typical, American in the old days. And what ends up happening is that, funny, the door-to-door salesman, that's like, I guess, was popular at that time, or this idea, this guy's got a briefcase and he's trying to hawk off some, goods that people don't really want. And this guy is trying to hawk off perfume, awful smelling perfume. And I love how upset the guy gets. The husband gets at this salesman, tries to kick him out. You can tell what he's saying through his lips. And so what ends up happening is this husband goes home with perfume on his collar, which is referenced a lot, in even modern, music. And the wife gets all suspicious that, he's been having an affair. And then he sees this pair of gloves, this pair of man's gloves, and he thinks the wife is having an affair. So they get into argument. And, just like the arguments in couples do, it usually goes nowhere, and both sides leave very angry. However, the husband gets so upset because he's probably had it up to here with it. Husbands are usually the ones that always admit that they're wrong. And so he ends up going to this lawyer and he wants a divorce. And you could tell that lawyer was surprised because, as we know, divorces were very uncommon and almost like they seem like they were illegal at this time. You can't get a divorce. That's crazy talk. But what's up happening is, I think that if it goes to middle ground, ends up being a separation, or they can't talk to each other. And so, some reason, the wife, I think, was thinking the same thing. She wanted to divorce him. Weirdly enough, nowadays it's usually the wife that divorces the husband, but at this time it seems like the husband was trying to divorce the wife. And she was probably crying because the reality was, probably at this time, the husband gets a lot more than the wife does, which is a lot opposite now. But so it ends up kind of fraying the relationship because they can't really talk with each other. And so they end up just writing each other notes, like, I've seen that happen in other movies too, where they're just writing notes to each other because they can't speak with each other, like, a challenge or something. Like, you can't speak to this person. The only way you can write is write to them. And what ends up happening is this dinner party happens, and they invite all their friends over. Of course, the men, they separate from the ladies. They're doing their own thing. Playing poker, which I've seen before. And that there was this play and a movie I watched called A Streetcar Named Desire, and that same thing happened where the men would play cards and the wives would kind of be separated off. It's a man's time. They're just the husbands talking together and playing poker and whatnot around this table. And I guess the maid, what ends up happening is the maid comes in through the basement, and the husband and wife send notes to each other like, oh, there's a burglar. And he grabs the gun. Of course, the wife wants him to do it, because the idea of, he's stronger, that kind of stereotype. And so ends up happening is the maid comes through the door, and they end up just laughing. And it's almost like that connection, where kind of the humor unites them together, whereas they were just kind of bitter at each other for their arguments. So what ends up happening is that the maid comes through the door, and what ends up happening is they kind of make up with each other after that kind of comedic. I wouldn't call it the climax of the movie because it was as the audience we knew who it was. But I guess the resolution at the end of the film was the fact that the husband and wife made up, and I guess it was kind of like a happy ending. Because it preserves the structure of the family. The husband and wife don't get a divorce, which would have been detrimental to both of them at the time. And they end up staying together, and the conflict is resolved. I think that's an important part of the movie is when you have. I think that's what an audience wants to see. Sometimes it's good to have a cliffhanger because it leaves the audience just thinking about on their own, like what is the ending to the film, like Phantomas. That was a cliffhanger, whereas this movie resolves the conflicts and leaves the audience feeling satisfied. So the movies this time around were a lot more entertaining and very eye-opening to society at the time. I can't base a lot of my assumptions off of movies because movies are purely fictional. If that were the case, I'd say that, from that Genie movie, the Golden Beetle, like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize that there was magicians at the time who could conjure up women with wings. We have to separate, fact versus fiction. But what we can see is some societal expectations about what is a man's role, what is a woman's role, and especially in marriages, we can see that. We can also see the technology at the time and the lack of technology. The kitchen, the fact that there is no refrigeration, the way the stove looks, how they wash their dishes, the lack of running water. Maybe how certain populations lived at the time. The more wealthier you are, the more access to those resources. So it was definitely a great. I thought the movies were spot on and funny. They're breaking this idea in my head that black and white silent films are boring. They're actually very entertaining. So that was this week for my film reviews. Thank you very much and have a great day.